The Lost Track of Time, Chapter 15. "You've woken them," whispered the timekeeper. Penelope peeled her hand away from her mouth. "Woken what?" she managed to say. "The fancies. This prison is full of them." "What?" asked Dill in surprise. "You mean those dust bunnies sleeping in the cells are fancies?" "Indeed," said the timekeeper. He got up from his chair and shuffled to the cell door, careful not to trip over his trailing beard. The fancies had somehow managed to escape their cells and were crowding the halls, chattering loudly. The timekeeper reached through the bars and began to pet the tiny creatures. "How can these be fancies?" said Dill, joining the timekeeper at the door. "The fancies I remember were glorious, magnificent, astonishingly beautiful." "If they're so wonderful," said Penelope, "why are there warning signs everywhere? Are they dangerous?" "Well, some would say they're dangerous," said the timekeeper. "They certainly are powerful, but only if they're fed, which of course they're not, or at least not anymore. That's why they're so thin and drab." "What exactly do they eat?" asked Penelope. She wanted to know just how dangerous these little creatures were. "Tickles," said Dill. "Tickles?" Penelope let out a nervous laugh. When she did, the fancies began, for just the briefest moment, to glow. "That's the spirit," said the timekeeper. The fancies hummed and twittered with pleasure. "It used to be everyone had their very own fancy. People tickled them quite regularly and rode them on great adventures." Just like Dill said, they were beautiful, huge and fluffy, with wild colors and even wilder antics. But feeding the fancies was declared impossible long ago, and so they withered away to almost nothing. It wasn't long before they were rounded up and imprisoned as a public nuisance. Now all they do is sleep. I'm sure they haven't been fed for... The timekeeper searched for the exact time and finally decided on eons. Penelope got up and cautiously approached the bars. All the eyes turned in her direction. "How did they get out of their cells?" she asked. "Oh my, no cell can keep the fancies from being free," replied the timekeeper. "They stay inside the tower because they're simply too weak to go anywhere else. It would take something extraordinary, something truly impossible, to fatten them up enough to fly away. But that will never happen. Kronos has seen to that." At the sound of Kronos' name, there was a rushing sound, like 1,000 birds taking flight, and the fancies scattered back to their cells. "Oh, well, there they go," said the timekeeper. He turned toward the table, and Dill helped him to his seat. "The sound of the great Moodler's name must have woken them," said the timekeeper. "I'm sure they miss her terribly, as do I." "You do?" said Dill, nearly dropping the timekeeper in his chair. "Of course I do. Oh, I suppose that's impossible too," he said, with a wave of his hand. "But ever since I lost track of time, I haven't cared a whit for Kronos' decrees. The great Moodler moodled up the most beautiful possibilities. What's the harm in that?" Dill and Penelope both sat down and leaned over the table toward the timekeeper. "Tell me," said Penelope, "do you happen to know where the great Moodler might be?" The timekeeper let out an enormous yawn and then answered, "Certainly." "Where?" Dill and Penelope shouted at once. But the timekeeper was already asleep, his chin resting on his chest, his head swaying slightly with each breath. Dill cleared his throat loudly and the timekeeper started awake. "Is it time to eat yet?" "Not yet," said Dill. The timekeeper looked longingly at the remnants of dinner on the table. "Pity," he said, picking up an empty plate. "I haven't eaten in 3 years. Or maybe it's been 3 hours. Can't really say." "You were just telling us about the great Moodler," Dill interrupted him. "Was I? Wonderful lady. I just saw her, yesterday." Neither Dill nor Penelope bothered to contradict him. "Can you tell us where she is?" Penelope pressed. "She's outside the realm of possibility, completely outside." His voice trailed off, and his eyes began to droop. "But how do we get outside the realm of possibility?" Dill asked. "Impossible to say. Completely yawn. Impossible." "It's very important that we find her," insisted Penelope. The timekeeper patted her on the arm. "I'm sure you'll find her in no time." He settled back into his chair and closed his eyes. "Wait a minute," cried Penelope. "You said yourself there's no such thing as no time." One eye opened. "Did I?" "You did." The second eye opened. "Well, that's not entirely true. There is no time like the present. You can bring one about if you know what you're doing and you're very lucky, but you have to do something very drastic and very dangerous. Go on, urged Penelope. Whatever it is, we'll do it. The timekeeper stroked his considerable beard. You see, no time will only occur if you stop time altogether. Once you stop time, you'll be completely outside the realm of possibility. That's where you'll find the Great Moodler. It's difficult to do, mind you, but it can be done. Did I mention it's dangerous? You did, Dill and Penelope said, rushing to reassure him. Well, if you're determined to do it, here's what you'll have to do. First, you'll need to climb to the top of the clock tower. Once you're there, the timekeeper's face suddenly disappeared into the most enormous yawn. Don't fall asleep. Please don't fall asleep, prayed Penelope. When the yawn was over, the timekeeper propped his head in his hands and continued. Once you're there, you'll need to find the door leading outside. It's very small. Go through it. You'll be standing directly under the north clock. Now, the next step is very important. If you want to create a no time, you'll have to... Just then, the timekeeper's head slipped out of his hands and dipped down before snapping up again. Dill and Penelope held their breath. You'll have to... The timekeeper's body fell forward and his head hit the table with a soft thunk. Mr. Timekeeper? Penelope gave the sleeping man a gentle shake. She was met by the sound of snoring. This is bad. Rotten. No good, said Dill, wringing his hands. We almost had him. Penelope wasn't listening. She took a deep breath and then shouted at the top of her lungs, Wake up! The timekeeper jolted awake. Once we're under the clock, what do we do? Penelope begged, clutching his arm. For a brief moment he looked at her, eyes wide. Hold on a second, he mumbled. So Penelope did. She sat and waited for him, listening for his final words. But they never came. The timekeeper collapsed onto the table and was immediately engulfed in a tide of sleep, and no amount of shaking would wake him. Dill and Penelope stayed up late discussing what they'd learned from the timekeeper. They both agreed they couldn't work around the clock another day. The constant ticking was so overwhelming that if they didn't do something immediately, they would turn into clockworkers and never find the Great Moodler or see the cuckoo ever again. If the timekeeper didn't wake up and finish giving them instructions by the time Officer 10 returned, they would have to go on without him. The risk of waiting was too great. Penelope offered to be the one to find the door. The timekeeper had said the door was tiny, and that meant Penelope was the one more likely to see it. In the meantime, Dill would create a diversion to keep the clockworkers from interfering in the search. Once Penelope found the door, they would go through it and position themselves outside the tower under the north clock. There, they would figure out how to bring about the no time. From what the timekeeper had said, once they caused a no time, they would be outside the realm of possibility entirely, and that's where they'd find the Great Moodler. How she fell asleep that night, Penelope never knew. She must have, though, because morning came and a new day began, just like the one before. The intercom announced it was time to get up. Breakfast was served, and as usual the timekeeper slept through it all. Both Dill and Penelope had tried to rouse him. They waved toast in front of his nose, pulled his beard, and dropped silverware next to his ears. They were both singing as loudly as they could and marching around the table when Officer 10 came to collect them. Hop to it! Officer 10 shouted, rattling the cell door and bringing them to attention. They obediently filed out of the cell and down the corridor. When Officer 10 wasn't looking, Penelope stole quick peeks at the fancies. There they were, small, drab, gray creatures, all sound asleep. Did they really rush out of their cells last night? It hardly seemed possible. They exited the prison and once again made their way down the empty hall toward the alcove. Dill took long, quick steps, and Penelope had to practically jog to keep up. But she didn't mind. Watching Officer 10 scurry after him, red-faced and scowling, was enough to lift her spirits. This little distraction didn't last long, however. Soon they were through the round door, up the stairs, and waiting at the threshold of the clock room. In you go, said Officer 10, shoving them inside, clearly glad to be rid of them. The clockworker who was sitting to receive them bowed with typical exaggerated politeness. Penelope couldn't tell whether it was the same one as the day before. They all looked disturbingly similar. While the clockworker escorted them to their stations, Penelope tried to look for the tiny door, but the clockworker kept politely redirecting her steps. Once they took their places at the conveyor belt, Penelope felt the tug of the familiar rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. In a matter of moments, the ticking of the clock felt like the beat of her own heart. She knew it wouldn't be long before it took over completely. They would have to act soon if they were going to act at all. Penelope looked up from her work to catch Dill's eye. To her surprise, he was standing idly by, fiddling with his ears. The clockworkers on either side of him were still moving at their steady rhythm, sorting tokens. But without Dill's help, they couldn't keep up, so the conveyor belt was strewn with loose time. Two of the clockworkers with silver badges climbed down from their platform and walked deliberately toward Dill. Back to work, if you please, they repeated over and over as they drew near. Dill paid them no mind. He picked up a timepiece, looked it over, and bit it gently. He made a nasty face and picked up a second token. He held a token in each hand, palms up. He moved his hands up and down as if comparing their weight. The clockworkers were almost upon him, and Penelope knew her time had come. Dill looked right at her and gave her a wink. Then, much to her surprise, he grabbed a whole handful of tokens and stuffed them into his suit pockets. The two official-looking clockworkers rushed at Dill. Stop right now! Stealing time is forbidden! At that moment, a gigantic alarm clock began to ring furiously. It was louder than a freight train and accompanied by all sorts of flashing lights and warning bells. The clockworkers didn't seem to know what to do when something out of the ordinary happened. They stood frozen at their stations while the siren wailed. This was the diversion Penelope was waiting for. She dropped down on all fours, crawled under the conveyor belt. Once she was out of the way of all the commotion, she popped out on the other side and ran. She didn't know which was the north clock, so she decided to run around the perimeter of the room until she found the door. Suddenly, a clockworker stepped out from behind a tangle of thick wires connected to the time machine. "If you will excuse me," he said, moving in front of Penelope and blocking her path. He held a very large wrench in one hand and an oil can in the other. Penelope's mind raced. "Use your head," she told herself. "Fight fire with fire." What fire did the clockworkers have besides their stiff, unrelenting politeness? Well, decided Penelope, I can be polite too. She turned toward the clockworker and smiled sweetly. "May I please borrow your wrench?" she asked. "But of course." The clockworker held it out. "Thank you so much." Once Penelope had the wrench firmly in her grasp, she threw it as hard as she could into the heaving mass of gears running the time machine. She heard a loud clang, followed by a clunk, and then a horrible screech. "You've been ever so kind," said Penelope with a curtsy, and then bolted past the confused clockworker. She could hear the engine slowing as it tried to spit out the wrench. "Please let that buy me some time. Please, please, please," she thought, and ran toward the nearest clock. Each clock was framed in brick, and Penelope figured that the door, if there really was a door, would have to be set inside it. She had almost run the length of one clock when she heard a whoosh and felt a soft gush of air. She looked over her shoulder. A long mechanical arm had emerged from high above the rafters. It swooped down, swinging around the room as if looking for prey. She noticed that the two clockworkers with badges had dragged Dill up onto their platform and were holding him firmly in place. To her horror, the arm came to a halt directly over him. Penelope froze as she watched the arm descend with a menacing clicking sound. With one swift movement, it plucked Dill up by the coat collar. The arm swung around the room and stopped over an empty spot on the floor. All the clockworkers stepped back, their eyes fixed on Dill. The floorboards lifted. A trap door opened to a dark hole. "Dill!" Penelope shouted. Dill swung his head around to look at her. "Run!" "Don't stop!" he shouted back before the arm dropped him into the darkness. Penelope heard the trapdoor slam shut and stifled a scream. Where were they taking him? She had to get him back, but Dill had told her to run. In a burst of panic and speed, Penelope took off. She turned one corner and started down the length of the next clock. Tears filled her eyes, but she kept on running. She had to find the tiny door. A whirring sound overhead made her look up. The arm had swung back around and was moving swiftly in her direction. Penelope realized why no one had bothered to pursue her. It was useless to run. The arm would catch her. She hunched her shoulders in anticipation. That's when she saw it. A door. A tiny wooden door. It was painted red like the brick, but there was no mistaking the glint of its brass knobs. Penelope sprinted forward. The door was only as high as her waist. She bent down and wrenched it open. Click! The fingers of the mechanical arm snapped inches from her head, where her head had been. Penelope saw a narrow ledge poised on the brick of a vast sky, but behind her the arm's hungry fingers drew back to strike again. She leapt outside and pulled the door shut behind her. Penelope inched along the ledge, putting a little distance between her and the door in case the arm opened. Thankfully, the door remained closed. The ledge ran around the entire tower, and when Penelope stood at her full height, the clock was at her back. She leaned against the cool glass, gripping the six to steady herself. She could feel the cold of the shadow above her and kept her eyes straight ahead. Be sure to watch part 2.